19th CPC National Congress, a key event in the political life of the party and the blueprint of development for China, comes at a time when Beijing is striving towards the dream of national rejuvenation. Dialogue anchor Yang Rui is joined by correspondents from Berlin, Cairo, Kuala Lumpur, London, New Delhi, Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington, D.C. to seek a better understanding of the event from a foreign perspective. Stay with us for Cross the Line, questions about the 19th CPC National Congress, only on CGTN.
Hello and welcome to Cross the Line, questions for the 19th Congress of the CPC. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. For our viewers, both at home and abroad, the upcoming 19th Congress of the CPC is no doubt an event of myth that evokes a lot of curiosity. To appease that curiosity, I'll be joined by our outstanding overseas correspondents to co-host the show. They'll bring us questions and perceptions of the event from a 100% foreign angle. To answer these questions and interpret these perceptions, we are joined in our studio by Xu Qinduo, a political analyst from CRI, and in Washington, D.C., our co-host Wang Guan cannot wait to tell us what question he is going to raise for this edition of the Cross the Line.
Indeed, Yang Rui, what a pleasure it is to co-host this show with you. You know, I've been a big fan of yours and your show. Today, my question really is the Chinese system, the Chinese meritocracy, an alternative to Western representative democracy, and perhaps a better alternative? And to answer that question, here with me, Martin Sief, a senior fellow at the Global Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Martin, my friend, great to have you with us.
My dear friend, always a pleasure.
So, like you have heard from my colleague Yang Rui in Beijing and myself, a big question. Is the Chinese model perhaps a legitimate alternative to Western democracy? Because here in a Western alternative narrative, you hear they portray it as if one is good, the other is evil. One is more efficient and effective, and the other is not.
Well, I think certainly at the moment you can certainly say one is more efficient and effective and the other is not. China, over the past 40 years, has been much more efficient and effective than the United States in generating increased levels of prosperity for its own people. Now, this is not to say that the Chinese meritocracy system is always superior, but it is certainly to say that the American system is not always superior. There are many forms of democracy. There are different forms of government in the world. There are different forms of meritocracy as well. One has to analyze every system on its own record. The record of China over the past 40 years has been extraordinary, and this is not given sufficient weight in the West. More people have been lifted out of poverty to a comfortable, sustainable standard of living under a sustainable system that has ever happened in human history before, and the prognosis for further growth over the next century or half-century is even better. This is a wonderful record of success. It's not to say you have perfection. No one has perfection. But you have a great reason to be tremendously proud of your record. By contrast, in America, the very reason President Trump was elected was precisely because of a revolt against the collapse in the standard of living over the past 40 years in America. And I've written books on this, and it's virtually impossible to get them published in America. None of them are used in any American colleges.
You can't get it published?
No, I can't get it published. I mean, the talk about freedom of debate and speech in America is very limited. You have a binary system here. You can either be a conventional liberal or a conventional conservative. There is no room for independent thought.
So, as an Irish American, you cannot get your critique book published here in the U.S.?
It's not because I am an Irish American. It's because I am neither conventionally Reaganite or conventionally Clintonite. You have to be one of those two models. There is no room for independent, creative thought. This is ironic because Americans always criticize China for allegedly not being creative. But the pragmatism and practicality and success of the Chinese meritocracy compares extremely well in economic terms with the decay in American society and the economic levels over the past 40 years. Again, this is why Bernie Sanders did so well in 2016. It is why President Trump was elected.
So let me ask you about President Trump, Martin, really. He was elected. We see this populism in Western Europe.
Precisely.
And also here in the U.S. After the election of Donald Trump, do you think there is reflection in mainstream Western scholarship and Western mainstream media about the Chinese alternative? Perhaps that is a legitimate and even better alternative to the U.S. representative democracy.
There is no reassessment at all. I mean, I am a great admirer historically of American representative democracy. It works for America, but that does not mean it is a model which should be applied around the world. The Americans are falling into the same trap that Lenin fell into in the Soviet Union after 1917, taking their own system and trying to impose it on the rest of the world, saying there is only one legitimate system. History shows us this never works. Different countries have different histories, have different cultures, have to develop their systems themselves. I am not hostile to democracy, but I am not going to condemn the systems of other nations, especially when they produce far higher improvements in living standards and human basic conditions, as you have achieved so dramatically in China over the past 40 years.
Finally, on China's model, people are talking about this Beijing consensus versus the Washington consensus. Do you think there's such a thing as the Beijing consensus? And if so, can you help us articulate it?
I think there is a Beijing consensus. I think it is already has and is going to have increasing impact across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And I think the Beijing consensus is, as you say, a meritocratic system, but at the same time with a framework of central government, but central government that recognizes it has a mandate and duty to raise the standard of living of its people, but is able to follow pragmatic policies to do so. If I may add a point on this, in America we are hamstrung by an obsolete ideology. The ideology is not democracy. The ideology is very recent. It is Ronald Reagan's demonization of governments. Now, actually, Reagan talked about government as evil, but he extended the size of American government more than any president in 30 years before him. So what Reagan did was different from what Reagan said. Today in America, you have on the right wing and even in the Democratic Party, following the Bill Clinton third way, ideologists who would reduce the role of government, eliminate it completely in the economy, and that does not work. It is simplistic and idiotic. In China, you have a very different system. You have a partnership between government and private industry and free enterprise, and it is not nailed down in precise ideological terms. Today, China is not rigid and ideological. It is American conservatives who are rigid and ideological. This is not understood. But back to your first very important point, you are absolutely correct. There should be a reassessment in America, not of the state of democracy, but to save democracy. They have to reassess political ideology and economic policy, and the elites are not doing it. Ordinary people recognize this. That is why they supported Trump and why they supported Bernie Sanders, why they rejected Hillary Clinton. They totally rejected Jeb Bush. They are tired of Barack Obama. But the intellectual elites in New York, Washington, LA, no, they are in their bubbles. Nothing impacts on them.
So politics stops at the water's edge here in America. Yang Rui, you've heard our points of view, our experts, and here I hand the time back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wang Guan, for bringing up the question on meritocracy, particularly as opposed to the electoral democracy in the United States. We are very much impressed by the review and the scathing criticism in such a review by Martin about the American political institutions. Any more questions you want to ask Mr. Xi Jinping? Wang Guan?
Indeed, Qingduo, my friend, my question to you is, how do people in China view their own political system? Because on one hand, you hear this camp of so-called Fenqing, right, angry youth who look up to the West, who think American model is a better alternative to solve many, if not all, of China's problems today. But on the other hand, you see a group of increasingly assertive youth, young people in China who are getting more and more confident of their own culture, their own society. So what is going on here back in China?
Those young people who are more pro-American, more pro-Western values, Western practice, you know, in their mind, of course, they would love to copy the democratic practice and also the other practices in those countries, mostly in the United States and the Western European countries, rich and stable and well-governed countries in general. But also remember, you know, they talk about it in the term of democracy in the election. Democracy in the election, there are other countries, like in Africa, Latin American countries, there are democratic countries. But they don't want to copy those countries. Why? Because I think ultimately in their mind, they didn't say it, but in their mind it is really about the pursuit of a well-governed society with stability and prosperity. That's the end goal, let's say. And coming back to this increasing optimism of Chinese young people, you know, recently there's a global survey by Ipsos in France. They found out that China is the most optimistic country in the world. 87% of the respondents say, you know, they are confident, they are optimistic about the next 5 to 10 years that China is on the right track to develop itself, to further develop the country. So I think this says a lot about their understanding of their own country.
Indeed, Yang Rui, I guess I assume that you would have more questions to my friend Martin C.
Martin, for those who are familiar with U.S. history in the post-war era, we are still awash with the bitter memories about what Senator McCarthy did in his crusade against communism. And many people were put under investigation on charges of treason or whatever. So is it true that many Americans still take China as a product of Stalinism? And the mere mention of Stalinism, people would think of Gulag and the Great Purge, which led to the arrest and killing of so many brilliant Soviet citizens. Now, whatever we do, it seems whatever we do, whatever we have achieved, we are always examine this through an ideological lens. Is this the Cold War mentality? Will it be very harmful for the improvement of a bilateral relationship?
Thank you. Thank you. That is a very wise and shrewd question that you give, and the answer, while clear, is not completely straightforward. You are absolutely correct. There is a hostile ideological bias towards China, and it is not racist. It is not a hangover directly from the McCarthy era. It is not based on capitalism versus communism. It is a political ideological bias. Since the time of Reagan, and especially since the end of the Cold War, since the end of the Soviet Union, an American generation has grown up that has been told and believes that the American political democratic system is the only perfect one in the world, and that the American system must be replicated throughout the world, and that other systems such as China's meritocracy are at best inferior, and in fact historically must eventually become obsolete or superseded by the American system. Now, this is lousy history, it is ridiculous prophecy, it is a joke as political science, but it is widely believed by the political classes. Every time Nikki Haley opens her mouth at the United Nations, she expresses this. There is an irony to this. President Trump is actually better than this. During his campaign, he actually was not a McCarthyite towards China, and certainly not towards Russia either. On the contrary, the neo-McCarthyites in America hate President Trump, because President Trump is a pragmatist. Even when President Trump argued that he wanted to make different trade deals with China, he always argued it on pragmatic economic grounds. He never, at the time, did it on ideological political grounds. There is no popular anti-Chinese sentiment among the American people. And even when President Trump was criticizing terms of U.S. trade with China, he was actually saying America should emulate China's wise policies. He often praised China's meritocratic and economic policies, and I believe he was right to do that. I do not advocate a weakening of U.S. Sino-American ties. I am all in favor of improving them. I would like to see America apply intelligently and constructively more of the same principles that China has in its economic policy. Meritocratic systems and democratic systems can both do this. But in America, America is not being democratic because the American so-called meritocracy, the American real political elite, is not listening to the message it got from the voters for both Bernie Sanders and President Trump in 2016. The American elite are not listening to their own public. And that public does not want confrontation with China or Russia. It wants peaceful coexistence. It is not getting it.
Qingzhuo, in the wake of the Cold War, many, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, color revolutions, Arab revolutions, and so on and so forth, many in China are wondering aloud what are the disadvantages of the two-party system and what are the vulnerabilities of the one-party system. I'm not talking about Chinese politics, but let's draw a comparison between these two different sets of political institutions.
Well, that's right. And previously, let's say before the 2008 financial crisis, it seems to the world like there's only one model of running your country. That's Washington consensus based on like democracy plus a free market economy. But as recently as, of course, the Arab Revolution or the failed some of the political elections, let's say, the rise of nationalism, rise of protectionism, it reveals more and more the problems, the shortcomings of the existing, say, two-party system or multi-party system in Western democracies. And if you compare them with China in particular, you would see, like in the Chinese political system, you do see fast decision and also fast and solid implementation of those policies with good results. And comparing with this Western practice, you do see it takes a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, a lot of political infight to reach a decision. And then when it comes to implementation, it is usually very slow too. So somehow you do see with the change of a party, like in the United States, you have a change of priorities of the policy. You do see there's a lack of continuity about the policy. So you do see advantages of somehow of the Chinese political system and more disadvantages of this two-party system or multi-party system here.
Do you think it is the one-party politics in China that's been able to lift up to half of the 1 billion out of poverty over the past 3 decades? And effectiveness and efficiency are not the problem. The problem is corruption. Now, President Xi Jinping has launched the high-handed crackdown and anti-graft campaign against the corrupt officials. The severity of the campaign has impressed the world, and do you think that has laid the groundwork for sustaining the economic growth and in terms of improving the social governance as well?
I do think so. I think there's obviously there's a clear need, necessity to deal with the corruption issue. First of all, corruption, basically every country could suffer a certain degree of corruption, but especially developing countries, China, India, and other developing countries. If you compare the Chinese practice with other developing countries, you do see there's a high degree of seriousness in dealing with such an issue, because for the Chinese Communist Party, President Xi Jinping made it very clear, like corruption is the issue which threatens the survival, the very survival of the party and of course the nation. So coming back to our the topic here, the one-party say rule in China, multi-party system in other countries here, I think for each party, each political system, it has its own strength and also weakness. Some people would say, for the one-party political system here in China, you have your strong advantages. So like one researcher from South Africa I talked to lately, he basically speak highly of the Chinese one-party system. He said, we envy you have a one-party system that is like it's easier to maintain stability, and it's easier to produce the right policy and then implement it, instead of having this prolonged, often political infights over sometimes pointless discussion, pointless fights over there. But then, people would be worried about like whether there's enough supervision of this ruling party. If there's some problem, who is playing this supervisory role, and whether there's enough, let's say, transparency, enough supervision here.
Oren Amir, former Israeli ambassador, said to me at least 15 years ago that China is also the envy of the Israeli coalition government. Look at the bipartisan wrangling, which was endless in the in the Israeli parliament. Having said this, what do you think of the ideology of neoliberalism, which seems to be declining against the backdrop of the 2008 financial crisis, particularly with the rise of populism in both Europe and the United States?
Yes, you are right. Actually, there's an increasing number of people blaming the neoliberalism for the recent, problems, let's say, after this, in the wake of the financial crisis, and also the rise of protectionism and nationalism in some countries, Western countries. And if you talk about the neoliberalism, you talk to different people, you probably get different definition. But usually it refers to this capitalism, the free market, globalization, you know, like elite ruling privileged minority group of people.
100% privatization of the economy.
Right. And if you talk to people from Latin America and African countries, people would tell you, you know, neoliberalism really refers to like, you know, privatization and free market economy, deregulation, tax cut. But usually that's, you know, it has failed basically in Latin America, you know, for countries you know, like basically now stuck with this trap, so-called middle income trap. And in African countries, it also has a very bad name, neoliberalism.
Right. So what do you think of the advantages of a competitive democracy? It means all the democratic forces in the CPC, the top advisory body, are in the same boat and on the same page with the ruling party, the biggest of its kind in the world. What does that mean for building a harmonious society?
Well, I think this, you know, the Chinese political system, it's quite open, actually. It borrows, you know, what it can, what it thinks that will work in China under the Chinese conditions. That's the opening up. We learned a lot, as you know, the architect Deng Xiaoping once said, you know, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse. So there's a huge amount of, let's say, pragmatism in the Chinese culture, in the Chinese political culture, I would say. Yes, you have one-party system, you have this consultative democracy. You receive basically opinions and criticism from different sectors of life, and then you take a careful look at them, and then you reach a wise decision. If you talk to the officials, they would say there's no fast decision. They say their principle is like a slow decision but a fast implementation. That is, when they reach a decision, they would make it open. This is the draft regulation. It's open to criticism and opinions. And then they would reach the final decision. When it comes to implementation, it's fast and solid.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely. What do you think of the issue of having democratic oversight?
Well, I think in China it has, if you look at this Central Commission of Disciplinary Inspection, I think for party members in China, for officials at different levels, they do, there's a strong supervision. There's no lack of supervision.
You mean the supervision comes from within the party?
Exactly.
What we call the Discipline Inspection Committee.
I think that's one very strong, very striking characters of the Chinese ruling party, the Communist Party. That's why it's very different from, say, another political party in the Western countries. It's different. It is the ruling party. It basically takes care of every sector of this whole country, but at the same time, it is held accountable for everything it does.
Thank you again, Wang Guan, for hosting the show with me, and thanks again to Xu Qinduo for his participation. One question answered, and more questions to come in our Cross the Line. Questions for the 19th Congress of the CPC Special Series. Want to know more about the next question is, and who will raise it, from where? Please stay tuned for our next episode of Cross the Line. Questions for the 19th Congress of the CPC Special Series.
Every 5 years, the Chinese Communist Party holds its National Congress. This month, the 19th Congress opens in Beijing. It will elect a new central leadership and chart the course for the party as well as the country over the next 5 years and beyond. Who will step into the party's top leadership, the Politburo Standing Committee? Will the Congress look to amend the party constitution? Which direction will the anti-corruption campaign be heading? How will the CPC manage the Chinese economy? foreign affairs and military. Tune into CGTN for all the answers as the CPC decides.